Hello, this is the voice of Stuart Pearce, and welcome to my series of Deep Dialogues. These are vital conversations I engage in with global soul stewards from all over the planet, providing us with vital understandings about how we can create a new hierarchy of values to help us evolve into a brave new world. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody. We have sitting before us the wonderful Marc Anthony. In fact, Marc and I were just sharing so intensely that I suddenly realized the time was skipping by. So thank you for being so prompt in leaving your comments in the chat box. Namaste, namaste, namaste to you, beacons of light. So as usual, what I'd love to do is, in fact, last week, Marc, we were actually sitting here waiting for my speaker of last week who didn't turn up. It's the first person in over 150 deep dialogues that I've done. Was I created this platform at the beginning of COVID because I noticed the vibrational shift in many of our conversations of going deep into the causative aspect of COVID and the way that the whole of our lives were shifting. So I'm really glad that you're here. So everybody, if you were involved in the termination or the abortion of last week, do not worry. Mr. Brandon Beecham is going to come back in 2 weeks' time, I think it is. But don't worry, I'll be leaving all sorts of information on the website, The Angels of Atlantis. Let me introduce you to this wonderful gentleman that we have sitting here because he is fascinating. Believe you me, he is fascinating. So Marc is an Oxford-educated attorney licensed to practice in the USA, including the US Supreme Court. Yay! Wow, what an achievement. Yet Marc is also a fourth generational psychic medium who appears on national TV and radio, including CBS's TV's The Doctors, Gaia TV's Beyond Belief with George Newry. And he also co-hosts a live stream show on the Transformation Network called The Psychic and the Doc. Marc is a featured speaker at many conferences, expos, and universities throughout the US, including Brown, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, you name it, he's been there, and is an avid psychic explorer, traveling to many remote mystical locations around the globe in order to learn more about their mystical and supernatural properties. Marc is the author of 3 best-selling books. They're also award-winning, such as The Afterlife Frequency, which of course is our title for an entree into this wonderful conversation that we're going to have. And this book, The Afterlife Frequency, was nominated to win a Pulitzer Prize. So we're in very hallowed territory here with this gentleman. And his other books are titles such as Never Letting Go, Evidence of Eternity. But to finish this wonderful introduction, Marc is the executive contributor to the Best Holistic Life magazine within the USA. Welcome, Marc. Namaste to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Namaste. It is such an honor to be here. I've really been looking forward to deep dialogues.
Well, thank you. Thank you. How deep can we go?
The Mariana Trench is the limit. So as deep as you want to go.
Bless you. Well, I'm intrigued, as we were just sharing before in our pre-show chat, I'm intrigued by the way that you've been able to balance the temporal existence of your attorneyship and working in extraordinary situations, practicing as a licensed attorney through 3 US states, as well as having access into the Supreme Court. And here you are, a psychic, so well known as the psychic lawyer. Do you bring psyche into your work as an attorney?
I do. Just as a point of clarification, these days I'm focusing strictly on my spiritual work. And it's a rather interesting story how I went from practicing full-time to this. But throughout the course of my life, and certainly my legal career, my psychic ability is part of my tool set. And it got to be So I started off as a prosecuting attorney, and then eventually I was hired into private practice. And when I was a prosecutor, and when you're a young prosecutor fresh out of law school, you get assigned to do first appearances. And
Mm.
so in the US, and when people get arrested, they have to be brought before a judge within 24 hours to determine if they can be released or should bail be posted. So I would be with my co-counsel, another prosecutor, and then there'd be the defense table, usually a public defender, and they'd bring people in, and I'd say, well, that one's a sex offender, that one's a drug dealer, that one. And my co-counsel would be looking at the reports and saying, how do you know this? And it got to be a thing that Marc knows things other people don't. And so it got to be a game that when we would do that, before they'd show me the police report, they'd like, what's he charged with or she's charged with? So, but there's other examples that I could go on with. But the thing is, people say, well, does that give you an unfair advantage? The truth is, we all have different abilities and different skills. This is one of mine. There's other people who have abilities which they use to the fullest extent in a courtroom setting. So absolutely, I always used my ability.
Yeah, yeah. And, unfair advantage seems a little bit unkind to the power of your talent. I'm sure that you were also deeply inspirational and therefore encouraging people to really tune into the sensitivity that is required to feel the multidimensional universe and how you can tune into, the particular ratios of human beings who happen to have crises and are either held or camouflaged or masked from whatever that role may be, particularly in pursuit of a wonderful act of justice rather than a commitment to judgment. So
Well,
tell us about your psychic generational powers, because this has been stimulated within the very fiber of your family context. So can you give us context for that, please?
certainly, both my mother and my father had psychic and mediumistic abilities. My father was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and then after the Navy, he became an aerospace engineer. My mother was a commercial illustrator, and I tracked in on both sides of the family, Stuart, these abilities back 4 generations into the 1890s. And I'm assuming that it goes further than that, but it was hard to get anybody who knew any of the stories.
Mhm.
And my father had 4 siblings. He had 3 sisters and a brother, but one of his sisters, Marjorie, had his abilities or similar abilities, as did their mother, Isabel, and their maternal grandmother, Grace. And then on my mother's side of the family, my dad's side of the family, they were very conservative, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Pennsylvania. In fact, my great great grandfather even founded the church in the town that my father grew up in. And in that side of the family, they had to keep it very clandestine. And my father was, when he was a teenager, he wasn't supposed to come into the house because he had his chores to do, because they had a big piece of property, because his mother and his sister Marjorie supposedly had the ladies over to play bridge. Well, one day he came home and he was listening through the parlor doors, and he realized they were doing readings. They were doing mediumship readings for ladies in the neighborhood. And then afterwards, he confronted his mother and said, I can do that too. And they were like, oh, but don't tell anybody. Meanwhile, my mother's family had emigrated from Italy, and the Italian side of the family looked at these abilities very differently. They referred to them as the gift of second sight. And my mother, wow, she had the whole package. And her maternal grandmother, whose name was Giovanna, was revered and respected in the Italian American community of New York City and North New Jersey. I always make the joke, it's kind of like Tony Soprano's stomping grounds. Okay, but it was that same area. And officials from the Catholic Church, from nuns all the way up to cardinals, used to come and meet with Giovanna. And what's really fascinating is in 2016, PBS, the public broadcasting system, they did a special on the Italian Americans. It was a 2-night special, and there was actually an entire segment about Giovanna and they actually referenced her psychic abilities.
Wow.
Yeah. So this has been running for generations, and it is the belief of those of us who study psychic phenomenon that this is an inherited ability, what's usually referred to as a recessive genetic trait. For example, a dominant trait would be being right-handed. A recessive trait would be left-handed, because like only 1 out of 10 people are left-handed. But when you have two parents that have the same recessive genetic trait, the likelihood one of their children having that trait increases, and that happened to be me.
Mm. And this is statistically proven.
Well, with recessive traits, with psychic phenomenon, this is being studied more. In fact, I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but I'm going to be part of an afterlife study involving mediums and mediumship at a major university in the U.S. But I've been studied at other universities, and I was actually studied somewhat at the Arthur Findlay College for the advancement of psychic science in England. So the more we're studying this, the more we're beginning to see that, yes, there's a genetic proclivity for it, but also that this isn't hocus pocus or magic, but that there is an actual reason why these things happen, and they're based on sound scientific principles.
And of course, we all endorse a little bit of magic. So what I'm really interested in the depth of this particular range of multi-perceptiveness is the behavioral feature. So when you awoke as a child to the possibility of being able to, or maybe not even the possibility, the probability of being able to see dead people, of being able to see extraordinary energies that others were considering to be supernatural or phenomenal, that it was endorsed by the family, correct?
Yes.
And so it was very easy for you to flow with the confidence of what that skill set is about.
I really feel very fortunate that I had the parents that I did. They both since transitioned to the other side. But when I was about 5 years old, or when I was 5 years old, I was about to start school. And my mother's family was Catholic, and my dad was required to convert to marry my mother. That's a funny story, but we won't take up time telling that, because when he asked my Italian grandfather for permission to marry my mother, he said, "Well, you must have become a Catholic." And he's like, "What?" And it's a really quite long and involved process. But he loved my mother so much that he did it. And I was about to start school. My father sat me down and he said, "You don't tell anybody about these things. You can tell your mother and I all you want, but don't tell anybody anything, because people who see things others don't get taken away." Well, Stuart, that really scared me. And if I can digress a moment,
Yeah.
I discovered later on why he was so worried about this. His sister Marjorie, who was also a medium, unfortunately, she married a religious zealot, and he feared her abilities. And these events happened about 20 years before I was born. That's why I didn't find out about them. It took me years to finally get my dad to tell me. And she was also very gifted at precognitive ability. In other words, foreseeing future events. And one morning, her husband was about to go to work, and he worked at a steel production plant in Pennsylvania. And she had a terrible feeling that something horrible was going to happen to him. And she begged him to stay home, and they got into a big fight. And he said, "Fine, I'll stay home. You and that voodoo stuff, I'm going to prove you wrong." Well, that day, a crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams, and all of a sudden the cable snapped, and it crushed the machine shop that he worked in and killed everybody in it. Now, logically, he would have been there.
Yeah.
You would think that he would have been grateful. Instead, it intensified his fear. And it's important in this show for us to address the fear aspects of these abilities and why they're illogical. But he was very, very afraid, and he conspired with an unscrupulous psychiatrist who diagnosed my Aunt Marjorie as a paranoid, delusional schizophrenic. They sent an ambulance to her home. Men in white jackets forcibly removed her from her home, took her to a mental institution, and she was subjected to involuntary electroshock therapy for over a period of 6 months. And the tragedy, Stuart, is it damaged her brain so badly that she was never able to communicate with spirits or see future events again. Now I understood when I was a little boy why my father was so worried that something like that could happen to me. And then here I am in Catholic school, and they're talking about angels and saints and all these supernatural beings. And at first I'm thinking, hey, this is the place for me. And then I started listening to other things that they were saying and realized, yeah, Dad was right. Keep my mouth shut.
And so we can see the context and the placement of what that fear is all about. But at least at home, it was endorsed. So if something occurred, in the simplicity of sitting around the breakfast table in the kitchen in the morning, and that you were all tuning in, it would be embraced.
Oh yeah, that was a typical Sunday morning breakfast.
For those people who are tuning in, who also remember as children, when they were children, that I don't assume that there are very few children tuning in this evening, but those of us who, are very alive within the context of our inner child, and who had this free-flowing currency of being very sentient, indeed of being hypersentient, and therefore being able to perceive the preternatural, perceive the supernatural, and talk about it, but were cast into the groove of fear within the family. What advice would you provide them?
For the children or the family or both?
Well, I'm thinking about those people who are now mature, who are listening in, but actually still bear the scar of fear within their beings, and perhaps have corrupted the wonderful natural abilities of being able to intuit and then move onto a much broader level through the psychic powers and then the definition of what the supernatural is all about.
That's a very, very good question. A lot of my colleagues have told me that they envied my childhood because I was in a family that didn't look at it as weird. It just is, is how we are. For those of you who have suffered the being outcasts or chastised, ridiculed, criticized, not just by societal members, but also by members of your own family, forgive them. And to paraphrase Jesus, forgive them, they know not what they do. Because these people were afraid. They were confronted by something that they didn't understand. And unfortunately, traditional religions characterize these abilities as something negative, when if you examine Scripture, there are several places throughout the Bible where psychic and mediumistic abilities are not only explained or demonstrated, but actually sanctioned. So forgive the people that gave you so much grief, so much heartache, and realize that they were filled with fear. And let that go. And don't let tomorrow take up too much of today. Focus on where you are now and on cultivating this gift, because it truly is a gift from God. And people, and when I talk about God, I don't mean a neurotic white man sitting on a throne with a scepter smiting people for not tithing 10% to a particular organization. I look at the divine power as the way Nikola Tesla did, as an energy that links all of us.
Yes.
And that there is an intelligence which flows through it. And this brings us into the realm of quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And because we're all energetically linked. And these are some of the things that I go into great detail in my book, The Afterlife Frequency, and some of the things that we're going to talk about today. But realize that being able to increase your sensitivity to this energy results in what we now call psychic and mediumistic activity. And there's nothing evil and nothing negative about it. And the more you work with it, you will see that the paranormal is very normal and that the supernatural is very natural. And there's no reason to be afraid of it.
Beautiful, beautiful. So the token and the technique of forgiveness, as soon as we forgive other, that automatically we feel divine grace moving through us. And so the scars, the wounds, the trauma, whatever it may have been, is also healed by divine grace, is it not? Which is a providential energy that you were beginning to refer to. I mean, the story that you've just told was very much my story as a child, because I spoke as an innocent, thinking that everybody could see what I was seeing. And I soon discovered that they didn't. And that was coupled with the fact that I had diminished learning skills. In other words, I was called educationally subnormal. What, what today we know is dyslexia and extraordinary synesthesia. So I was seeing sound and floating on the waves of sound. But of course, it was not agreeable. My father was a war hero, a military man, an august member of, the servant of the royal family, and, wasn't just simply not willing. But I had a grandfather, my mother's, my maternal grandfather, who was a farmer, and he saw spirit. So he became a benefactor and a protector. However, so I'm just simply casting the vibrational net wider in synchrony with what you're saying. But the wonderful technique that you were saying about just forgive them and thereby forgive oneself is absolutely crucial, so that we cease telling the stories with the revenge complex, with the venom, or with the empowered negativity, that we begin to take full responsibility for the fact that whatever we see before us is also a mirror image of what's going on within. And therefore, when we were babies and discovering all of this, that literally we're being led in the direction of really understanding how extraordinarily powerful we are when we move into this context. I just wanted to, underline that several times and to endorse very fully what you're talking about. So that, Steve's saying, one of our contributors here, one of our listeners, God got a bad rap by orthodox religions. So we go into the formal aspects of how dogma is no longer appropriate for us, because we're beginning to, as you hear in my introduction to this deep dialogue, we're developing a new hierarchy of values. The most important thing is, Marc is saying, is we need to release fear. And after all, look at his namesake, the great Marc Antony in Shakespeare's play. He was an extraordinary warrior hero who was always seeking the most precise, just aspect of human behavior. You touched into the bounty and the beauty and the providence of Afterlife Frequency. And I'd love you to touch into that whole substance of how you, through whatever capacity it was, because we haven't really spoken about this in our pre-show chat, about the electromagnetic soul aspect. I'd love you to speak on that level, please.
Certainly. I've spent years studying the human brain because in my practice of law, I specialized in head injury litigation. So I had to learn, I had to study neurology and neuroscience, and I started seeing how the brain worked and how the brain may be 2% of the body's weight, but it uses 20% of the body's electromagnetic energy. The most energy is used by the heart, which makes sense because it's a pump and it's got to be pumping constantly. And then I started studying about brainwave frequencies, because when people get head injured, they have to be their brain has to be examined through an EEG, an electroencephalogram, or a QEEG, a quantitative electroencephalogram. And there's 5 brainwave frequencies. There's gamma, this is when you're doing calculus homework. I mean, your brain is running at full throttle. Then in the activities of daily living, we're in the beta state, beta frequency. As we begin to relax, either meditate or drift into a daydream, that's alpha. Then theta is deep sleep, where you dream. Delta, very little brainwave activity, but it's important because that's where your body heals and regenerates and fights infections. but it's the alpha theta border where there is a band of frequency between about 3 to 4 megahertz up to about 13 megahertz. Now, normally we hear like, oh, raise your vibration rate. But this is a lower frequency, but this is also where spirits are able to lower their frequency and make a frequency match on the alpha theta border. This normally happens when we're asleep. That's why so many of you that are tuned in have had an experience where a deceased loved one will communicate with you in your dreams. But it's not a dream, and you know it's not, because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a realistic feel to it. And when you come out of it, you felt like you had an authentic conversation with your loved one who's passed. And that differs substantially from the surrealistic quality of dreams where all of a sudden a kite turns into an elephant or, whatever. But I started examining this, and then I started looking at what every great spiritual teacher, from the sages of ancient India through Zoroaster, through Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Lao Tzu, Gandhi, the Native American spirituality, the religions of the Pacific, that the who and what we are, consciousness, as it's called in science and psychology, spirit or soul in matters of faith, pre-exists your body, comes into your body, moves on after your body dies. So I start reconciling this then with neuroscience, identifying the brain as having a complex, the most complex energy field in the body, and the second law of thermodynamics in physics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. Then, looking at quantum mechanics, we know that everything's made of molecules, which in turn are made of atoms, which in turn are composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which are composed of the smallest particle of all, a quantum. That's where the term quantum physics, quantum mechanics comes from, which is pure electromagnetic energy. And then it dawned on me that the who and what we are is pure consciousness that is eternal electromagnetic energy. And that's how I coined the term electromagnetic soul. And my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Gary Schwartz from the Laboratory of Advanced Consciousness and Health at the University of Arizona, has incorporated he calls it the EMS, electromagnetic soul, into his work. And he said, Marc, I also want you to think of electromagnetic soul, the second word soul, as standing for the source of universal love. So that is how I came up with the term the electromagnetic soul, which is the foundation for understanding the afterlife, spirit communication through a medium, visitations where they come to visit you, near-death experiences, shared death experiences, deathbed visions, and out-of-body experiences. The EMS is the building block, the foundation for understanding all forms of spirit communication. And in what differs about my book from other books in the field is all those other phenomenon are being treated as separate categories and studied separately when they're not. They all have a commonality, and it's all based on quantum physics, which is the electromagnetic soul.
Yeah. And also prompts behaviorally to the substance of co-creativity, and the fact that we know that the great principal endeavor of our soul is to reach into love, empathy, compassion, to develop inclusivity. So as the highly tuned individual that you are, able to balance the left and right brain, able to move through the dynamic reflex of what it has been in the past to practice law, as well as being this subtle mechanism in touch with the quanta reality of the eternality of soul. You must have special practices that you engage in to constantly tune your physiology, your neurology, into being the great receptor that you are. Is that so?
It is, and not all of my colleagues in this field adhere to the type of things that I do. I don't drink alcohol. I don't smoke. I don't do recreational drugs. I know some of my colleagues drink, and I'm not crashing on anybody who does, but for me, that has never worked. I have to keep a clear and incisive mind. I make sure that I get cardiovascular exercise every day because you have to get oxygen flowing through your system. I'm very careful about what I eat. And let me tell you, I love desserts and I love junk food, and I try not to touch those unless it's a special occasion. I also make sure that I meditate on a daily basis and I pray. Now, prayer is associated with religions, and I know earlier we are talking about religions. I'm going to digress just for a moment. I don't have a problem with religions because why were they created? Well, of course, there's the control aspect, and there's been a lot of negativity with them. But since the dawn of human history, Stuart, people have communicated with spirits, interdimensional communication, our material world dimension and the other side dimension. They have overlapped, there's been communication. And people developed, humans created religions as an interface between the finite perceptive abilities of the human brain and the infinity of the other side. Because when dealing with the afterlife and the afterlife frequency, we're dealing with infinity, which our brains simply can't comprehend. Our electromagnetic soul can, because once it's free of the host, which is the brain, it is capable of infinite perception. So it's a lot easier for people to perceive God not as an infinite quantum electromagnetic field, but it's much easier to relate to the person of Jesus or Shiva or Vishnu, or even though Buddha is a supernatural teacher as opposed to a god, or some other deity, because through that anthropomorphized version of infinity, we can relate to that. And there's really no problem doing that. Where religion goes wrong is when people with ego-driven agendas, and ego stands for edging God out, hijack a belief system to justify their ego-driven agenda, which involves anger, bigotry, hatred, and violence. And that's when it ceases to be about God and becomes entirely about ego, which is me as the center of the universe, me, me, me. And so that's why I don't have a problem with religions. I love what Gandhi said once. He said, I like your Christ, but I don't like you Christians because you don't act like your Christ. And so when people are saying, well, I'm a Christian or I'm a Hindu or I'm a Buddhist, great, then act like one.
Cool. So there's a lot of information here. And again, a lot of that information rests on this immensely agile mental body that you have. But I know that you're also very aware of the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual bodies coming together as an integrated whole. And what I'm interested in is that when you're really tuning into the slipstream of energy that we're calling psychic awareness,
Right.
that it becomes a highly sensory and sensual process for you rather than just an intellectual process. I mean, it's wonderful to hear you being able to define through the scientific ratio or the scientific perspective all of these particular features. But I believe that we're on the brink of something really extraordinary, where we begin to recognize that feeling is the language of the soul, rather
Oh,
than just thinking.
I totally, not
So
only do I believe
can I
that.
just finish?
No, go
So
right ahead.
you spoke of this, this wonderful awareness of your apparatus. I do not smoke. I do not drink excessive amounts of coffee. I don't drink alcohol. I live a certain health regime. So I'm constantly tuning my body into a state of rest, because I know when I'm in a state of rest, I meet my center and the two hemispheres move into hemisync. And as a result of that, my pranic cord opens and I can feel that I'm moving into that supra level of human consciousness. It's not just we're terrain people. We're moving from the terrain, through the terrain, into a recognition of the preternatural world. And I'd love it if you could speak to that, because you have a very remarkable ability, I sense from an intuitive point of view, to really tune into the meeting point between flesh and spirit. And I would love you to be able to share with us the very special feeling, because like a lot of US citizens, you move very fast. And so your energy often goes up here, which is great. And it's full of the celebration of the wonder of who Marc is. But it also is living within the intellectual domain. And if we can come into the heart, I mean, this is my particular preoccupation, because, you know, my gift to humanity is that I tune everybody into their note, you know, that the fact that we each have a note. And that if we tune into our note, we come into our heart. So it's right in the middle of our range, our vocal range. And therefore we reach optimum pitch, which again is a way of being able to balance and integrate, center the conviction of who we are on all levels of experience: earth, water, air, and fire. So what do you feel is your interface between flesh and spirit?
The reason I'm hesitating is there's so much information flooding into this. Feeling is so incredibly important, and when I everything that I do as a medium is about opening up to frequency. And so when I open up to frequency and spirits come forward, you ask, like, how do I feel? It's interesting when I see video of myself doing this, I get this, I actually get this physical shaking because I feel this tingling going right down my spinal column. And that's because the electromagnetic souls of one or more, usually a group of spirits, are communicating with me, and their electromagnetic frequency is now interfacing with my body's EM field, and you get that response. As a quick aside, a lot of times people fear spirit communication because when they encounter a spirit, they get cold chills and tingles throughout their body, which is the same physiological response of fight or flight. But when you work with tuning into spirits, you realize that that's merely an electromagnetic physical response, and so it's nothing to be afraid of. So that would be the first sense that I feel. And I also find that if you try too hard, you create a block. So I call it a passive assertiveness, not passive aggressive. Passive in that I'm relaxed and open, assertive in that I'm welcoming as opposed to being demanding. And I teach people how to do this through the raft technique. And the raft technique, that's the best way I can explain all this. I was here in my office and I was working on the manuscript for the Afterlife Frequency, and then I hit the dreaded writer's block. And Stuart, I know you're a writer, and doesn't it always occur when you've scheduled that entire day off to work on the book? You know, it's like I was just so frustrated, and I've been writing long enough to where I know walk away. So I thought I'll go take a walk by the ocean because I live near the beach, and of course the electromagnetic energy of the salt spray and all that. So I'm walking toward the beach, and I get this tingling sensation. I'm like, okay, somebody's communicating, and it directed me in the opposite direction along this bike path. So I'm walking down this bike path near my house. It's around midday. Two objects are glowing in the light. And I look down, and it's a nickel and a penny, a 5-cent piece and a 1-cent piece. And I'm thinking, oh, and I go to pick it up, and I hear my mother's voice from spirit. And she said, if their head's down, it's bad luck. And I'm laughing because that's an Italian superstition. Then I hear my dad's voice. It's money. Grab it. And so I'm laughing, and I'm holding this nickel and this penny. I go, oh, look, 6 cents. And then I said, Sixth sense. Now the cold chills and tingles start intensifying. And I said, okay, mom and dad, what are you trying to tell me? Then I see an image of my father, the Navy SEAL, standing in the ocean holding this raft, this blue canvas raft. I remember when I was a kid, we used to take it to the beach and we'd ride waves on it. And I'm thinking raft. Then I hear my parents' voices in unison teach people to recognize signs from spirits, accept the contact is real, feel it without overthinking, trust the message. I go, RAFT, raft. And then I knew, and then I ran back and the writer's block was over. So for everybody listening, when you feel something like my parents walked me through it, I recognized the signs from the spirit. Okay, I saw the nickel and the penny. I accepted the contact as real. But, and this is the answer to your question, Stuart, it's the third step, feeling without overthinking. And this is where most people will go wrong, because immediately you'll start the negative self-talk. This is my imagination. Clearly, I'm making this up. Oh, this is a coincidence. This is impossible. And then you've torpedoed the experience. But feel, okay, this is the sign, and then trust the message. And I, since releasing the Afterlife Frequency with the raft technique, I've gotten emails and my speaking tours, hundreds of people saying, I use the raft technique all the time now. And it's getting past that third step because we tend to overthink things. And of course, intelligent people do overthink things. And that is an asset in your day job. But when dealing with spirits, you have to feel first, think later. And, and as men, you and I really had to work at that one because men aren't supposed to feel anything, but we do. We have hearts, we have tear ducts, we have feelings for a reason. And once you get those blocks out of the way, you'll start feeling messages from spirits all around us. And that will increase your spiritual situational awareness.
Mm-hmm. And so what comes to my mind is that one of the great techniques that I recommend is silence, solitude, and stillness. That if we can practice meditative silence, solitude, and stillness, that we're removing the excessive egoic need for doing, which of course we've all been conditioned by, and we move more into, no, I'm a being, I'm a human being. This is what's so remarkable, isn't it, about the Native American people when we look at the extraordinary stillness and gravitas that they have. And the belief in the Shante Ishtar, the belief in the single eye of the heart, so that they train all of their consciousness into the heart, because they know that that's the USB port, as we would say, into the divine, into the spirit of consciousness of the quanta that you were referring to. So this also allows us to be extremely practical about our healing processes at this time. And when I say healing, I really mean a movement back to wholeness, so that we release all of the fractured membrane within that perhaps is creating some form of holding that leads to dis-ease, or something which is really very, very difficult to. I spent 4 hours in the dentist chair today, so I'm surprised that I'm sitting here and making sense. That it was, just really examining another transitional frequency of what I had been containing as an ancestral blueprint. Because as I lay in the chair, I breathed deeply and went into meditation, went into alpha, and asked my mother, who has been with me for the last 40 odd years. She was my tethering mechanism or my centering mechanism when I was a child. So she, again, was a sort of protectress, unconditional love, unconditional love, unconditional love, and would always say to me, darling, I don't mind what you do as long as you don't frighten the horses. The horses, of course, can be described as all sorts of malfaction that's taking place. But anyway, I'm tuning in and asking, well, what is this all about? from a point of view of spirit, and it being revealed to me that I'm actually releasing an ancestral wound that I've been carrying within my own physiology for, I'm in my 70th decade. So I've been carrying it for a very, very long time. And it seems to me that you're also professing in the similar direction, that if we examine the holistic nature of ourselves by being temperate in the use of our energy, and this wonderful point of inspirational referencing that you gave us, reminded me also of Albert Einstein, that he discovered the law of relativity sunbathing in Hawaii. And he
Yeah.
wasn't actually standing at a chalkboard working out all of those complicated formulae that we see, but actually was examining, in again, that wonderful shift of alpha where the two hemispheres connect, and there it all was. So we need to really calm down much, much more.
Yeah.
This is brilliant. So when we go into, when you talk about spirit communication, near-death experience, and deathbed visions, or indeed counterposed with the shadows of superstition, which you already really referred to, what you're doing is bringing in some really powerful thoughts about how 21st century science is interfacing with the world of spirit. And I wonder if there were any other extractions that you could, not distractions, but extractions from the powerful research that you've done, which is, from all that you've given us, experiential, that things have come up. Are there any other techniques that you use to assist?
Well, I like what you said about quiet and how the Native Americans embraced quiet, because in the 21st century, we are bombarded by distractions on a scale never before seen in humanity. Uh, Cell phones. People are constantly on their cell phone, and there's something about it, and it's designed this way, that in things like Facebook, to create the same processes in your mind, in your brain, that occur with addiction. That's why people have to constantly look at their cell phones. Turn those things off. Take the earbuds out. Listen to the world. Oh, yeah, listen to the world around you. A lot of people find being in nature very healing. Well, it's more than just because it's pretty green trees and leaves and flowers. There's a completely different frequency in nature, which is very calming and very healing. I'm fortunate I live near the ocean, so I oftentimes will go for a walk along the beach, and there's something about the water that just calms me down. And I had to laugh when you said how Einstein developed his theory of relativity on a beach in Hawaii. I get some of my best ideas when I'm walking along the beach and I'm not thinking about it. It just comes to me. And that's because, think of your consciousness as a whiteboard, and you've been writing on it all day, every thought, every impulse. It's a mess by the end of the day. So by either meditating or just doing something quiet in nature, you're erasing all of those distractions, and then the one important thought will appear. So I think that silence is very important. That's what many people achieve through meditation. You can do that. Many people, when they pray, and it doesn't matter if you use standardized prayers or you just talk to the divine, when you're doing that, you're erasing the whiteboard. So I think those practices are extremely important as well. I also think what's real important is to do kind deeds to other people. Um, One thing I like to impress upon people: we all have elderly relatives or friends. Pick up the phone, don't text them. Pick up the phone, call them, write them a letter. You can even just get a nice little thinking of you card. What do elderly people get in the mail? Bills and junk mail, solicitations. They get a card from you. It makes their day. If you see an older person struggling at a grocery store, open the door for them. help them to their car. Because when you start doing positive things, and don't do it because me, you're doing it out of love for another person, particularly someone you don't even know. And I find that is so rewarding. And there's an old saying that character is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. So yeah, when you do something kind for another person, don't do it. Look, everybody, I am doing that. Then it ceases to be about love and it becomes an ego thing. So those are my recommendations for enhancing spirituality. It's do positive things and take some time to recharge your batteries in nature, in a silent activity. I saw something very funny on Facebook, speaking of social media, but there's a group of people in a public park and they're all looking and they're all playing with their cell phones. And in the background, Bigfoot's walking by. And the caption was, "This is why there's no recent photos of Bigfoot," because everyone's so busy looking at their cell phone.
Yeah, exactly. And so, these are wonderful, wonderful techniques. I'm not even going to debase them by saying tips. They're techniques. And of course, the wonder of what you were sharing with us is about how you were in this consternation of the writer's block by leaving the page, as it were, leaving your typewriter and then going for a walk on the beach. We return to flow because the circadian rhythms of the planet automatically embrace us and bring us into, because we are vessels of these circadian rhythms, bring us back into the synchrony of what Mother Earth is trying to teach us. And then something remarkable takes place, as you're saying. This is absolutely amazing, and I feel I could go on talking to you forever and ever. We have about 6 minutes left, and I just wanted to open up to all of the wonderful people that are here. If you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask Marc over the next five or 6 minutes, that would be absolutely wonderful. Please just, don't write essays in the chat box, in the comment box, but write simple questions. The other point that I'd love to draw to, it's really interesting because I wrote myself a list of questions, and actually what we've done is we've answered every single one of them psychically. So I was opening up to a bit of precognition before we came on air. But I do have one question which I'd love to refer to. You have much experience working with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the victims of homicide. Please, could you illuminate on the sort of techniques that you've enlisted to help people, particularly, PTSD is on everybody's lips at the moment, isn't it?
First off, when understanding PTSD, we have to realize that in one form or another, it may be on the lower end of the scale or the higher end, everybody suffers from it. And let's say you're there when a loved one breathes his or her last. It could be in hospice. That leaves a trauma. What if you're the victim of a violent assault or, God forbid, a parent who sees one of their children get killed? This is PTSD. The way that I have been able to help people with post-traumatic stress disorder is through my ability of spirit communication, where I connect people here with their loved ones in spirit, the ones who their death is what triggered the PTSD in that person. And the Afterlife Frequency has several stories about that, but leaving aside the stories, how does spirit communication help? Well, first off, when a spirit can come through and explain to the person that they're not responsible for the death, and especially with parents, even if the parent had no hand in the death of their child, parents tend to feel responsible and guilty because as a parent, you're supposed to swoop in at the last minute and save your child, and helping to alleviate that guilt. The other aspect is confronting what has caused the post-traumatic stress disorder. When you are able to confront it, yes, it's going to be painful. Yes, it's going to hurt. But by confronting it, understanding it, acknowledging it, and not blaming yourself, it begins to erode at the pain that it causes. Survivor's guilt. So many people think, I wish I would have died, not her. That is very, very normal. But spirit communication can and will put this in perspective. And many times the spirit will say why it was that person had to die at that particular time. So those are some of the factors, Stuart, that go into dealing with PTSD and survivor's guilt. I know we're short on time, so I just want to give you a more concise answer.
And I just wanted to, because it's very interesting the way that unconsciously our audience are leaving interesting statements in the comment box. Steve, Marc lives in Florida. And Nikki was writing, so frustrating, my Wi-Fi broke down during this. Do not frustrate. Why? Because this extraordinary conversation is being recorded. And so at a later date, you can go back and revisit and pour into the extraordinary riches that Marc is actually casting before us. Let's not be swine. Let's feel that his pearls are truly, truly, registering within our consciousness. So please don't frustrate. It's a perfect opportunity to pick up the things that so often frustrate or beguile us. Final question, Marc. We're living at an extraordinary time.
Yes.
And you're helping us to understand the interface between science and flesh, or the metaphysics of our existence. What is your prime motive for the next 10 years? What do you wish to realize or dream into creation?
I think the most important thing I can accomplish in my life is to help people, not to tell them, but to help guide them to understand that the divine power that we call God, the energy that binds and connects all of us, truly exists, that our souls are immortal living spirits, that the afterlife, heaven, nirvana, whatever name you want to assign that dimension exists, that we can communicate with electromagnetic souls in the afterlife, and I find this the most comforting of all, that when it is our appointed time to leave this material world, that we will be reunited with our loved ones in the afterlife frequency, the dimension of the other side. I think that's the most important thing I could possibly do with my life. And I don't tell people that you have to believe. I just tell you that you should. It's up to you how you get there. But I'm happy to show you what my experience, what my research, what my findings have helped other people and what I've discovered.
Beautiful. Wise teachings. Fascinating. We unfortunately have run out of time. Well, not run out of time. That's a ridiculous thing to say, but we've got to the end of the time frame. And so on your behalf, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank officially Mr. Marc Anthony for all of, spending his time, these invaluable hours that he has. He could have been walking on the beach or writing another book, or indeed tuning into spirit context. But here he is sharing with us. So Marc, I hope you feel your heart is warmed by all these wonderful people who are sending lots of love to you. And thank you for this considerable contribution to the nature of this project, Deep Dialogues. Thank you so much. And if you can please just stay there for a moment while we close down. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. And I know Marc will join me in saying namaste, namaste. And I look forward to seeing you at the same time next Monday, where there is somebody very remarkable. I won't release now who it is, but a very, very tasty individual indeed. So take care, and please practice all that Marc is recommending. Namaste, namaste. Thank you very much, Ryan.